Okay, so we're continuing on with painting methods, and I'm introducing what's called the Continuum of Abstraction now. So I like to talk about artistic styles when it comes to painting because it seems like painting has a wider variety of this, but it can work in all different art forms, whether it's drawing, printmaking, sculpture. A lot of people think that depending on how skillfully an artist can technically produce things, that is draw and represent the real world, that might be the qualifications for them being a good artist. However, there are plenty of good artists that are working not within photorealism, but they're working out here as well. So I'm going to kind of qualify this for you. Again, think about this as a continuum. There's no real stopping point. It's going to continue on in each direction. And there's sort of a sliding scale in here. It's very subjective. It's not objective so much, but there's some certain observational things that we can do to qualify a piece as being photorealistic, abstracted, or non-objective. So I'll start first with what we think of commonly as the most skilled types of artists. So with photorealism, technical skill is most important. In photorealistic or realistic artwork, the faithfulness to reality is very, very acute. So when we get into abstracted work, the technical skill is still kind of important, but there are some choices that the artist is making within the abstracted realm that changes it from a photorealistic to a less realistic. So I'll talk about technical skill while it's still important. It's important, but not so much. I would say less than photorealism. Because the artist is making choices to change the subject matter in some way. So the faithfulness to reality is lesser than this. So I would say it's not as faithful. It's somewhat unfaithful. So within abstracted work, we're not seeing something that looks exactly like what we're used to seeing. There could be some expectation failure there when you're looking at a painting and you're like, well, why did they choose to change the way it looks, simplify it, or in some way, shape, or form change it? So I always say this is change from reality in some way. So that's going to be my last little criteria here. It's changed from reality. Not a lot, but enough that it's not photoreal. And typically there's an expressive reason for that. So with non-objective, we're starting to release that technical skill. So technical skill is really not that important here, as in drawing and painting things to look realistic. That stands for important. Okay? As far as faithfulness, it's completely unfaithful to reality. Totally unfaithful to reality. Now, it's completely altered from reality, so it doesn't really make sense to talk about how much it's changed from reality, but we will say that in order to be a non-objective artist, you have to have a good imagination. Because there's not anything really represented here that we're used to seeing in real life. So while this is all good in terms of identification of what these mean, it's more important to really identify things that have this sort of continuum and sort of represent that. So I've gotten some paintings, and this is a little exercise I do in class. And I always start with photorealistic. We're going to be making 3 paintings. Of those 3, we're going to be working within each one of these realms in some way, shape, or form. So start first with the photorealistic. So Chuck Close is one of my favorite artists, and this is a painting that he did in the 70s. It's one of his oldest and probably best examples of his highly photorealistic work. This is a really large painting. It's 10 foot by 8 foot. And he would paint his friends, and he would paint them with high detail. He would almost always use a grid method to get everything looking exactly like he wants it to. So he would paint every little chest hair, pores in the neck, every little imperfection he would really capitalize on. So people would say that Chuck Close, and pretty much would agree, I think everyone would agree, that he's very skilled as a painter, right? So he uses monochrome a lot of times, or achromatic. He doesn't use color at all, because it's easier for him to work with just black and white in painting media. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and put this one, let's see, we'll stick it right here, because we would say that it's very photorealistic. The artist hasn't made any changes from his subject matter as such. Another one of my favorite kind of photoreal artists is Audrey Flack. And so she was another photorealist working 60s, 70s. She's still working today, but she doesn't just work in paint. She works in a lot of different media. But she uses really short space and cramped compositions where she sets up still lives that are basically artifacts about her life. And they typically have some kind of an expressive meaning when put together. But when we look at this, really what we're admiring is how skillful this person is at representing the real world. So we would say this person, again, highly photorealistic. So Audrey Flack goes there too. We would probably say she's on par with Chuck Close. So a lot of artists will switch from a highly realistic, and maybe for some reason they choose to become a little bit more abstracted. And so this is another of Chuck Close's paintings, a more recent one. And so he has definitely changed from his previous style here. We see that he's representing the portrait. It's a self-portrait, but using that grid method, what he's decided to do is go in diamond shapes rather than the square grid. And then instead of mixing his colors for purity, he's basically using a color swatch that he would use to mix basically a skin tone within all of these areas, and then instead of like blending them out nice and smoothly, he paints them in sort of concentric rings. But when we get back from the work, we can see that he's representing a portrait, right? But it's been changed from reality. So while technical skill is important here, it's less important than it is over here. Faithfulness to reality, somewhat faithful because we can tell it's a portrait. However, he's changed it quite a bit from reality, and he did that for an expressionistic reason. So it takes a bit of imagination to start thinking about, maybe why he's doing that. So we'll put him there. Another artist that you actually might be familiar with is Vincent van Gogh. So this is his Starry Night. We can tell what's going on with this piece. We can tell that there's a landscape element. We can tell it's a nighttime thing. There's a township down here. A lot of people debate about what this thing is, whether it's like a tower, a castle, something like that, or just a bunch of trees that are closer to him. But he was very much abstract. He changed a lot of his work from reality, and that was kind of like unpopular at the time that he was making his work. So within the Impressionism and Post-Impressionism movements, everybody was sort of working differently than this. They were a little bit more realistic, and so he kind of wasn't accepted in his time for this. So we can see that with the thick brush strokes and pastel work and a lot of the sort of lack of detail and the expression and energy of the artist, we can tell that it's definitely changed from reality. It's somewhat faithful and somewhat unfaithful because we can tell what's going on. It does require some skill to be able to have a good compositional sensibility and to use a lot of monochrome colors and then to work with colors in such a manner that they fade in and out from each other. So we would definitely say that he's abstracted as well. So this is one of my favorite contemporary modern artists. So his name is Joseph Lee, and he's actually down here. This is not a very good image, so I'm kind of getting it close to the camera. I hope you can see it well. But he definitely does a lot to abstract his work. We can tell that it's a portrait, basically because he's painted out the nose and the hair and the ear to be somewhat realistic. But everything else is just like really thick swatches and sort of like very motion enhanced actions of the artist, like scraping and piling of different colors one on top of the other, where he's blurred out the mouth and then he's brought some swipes that are almost kind of aggressive across it, like he's silencing his viewer, his his subject. The eyes are not as detailed, but we can kind of see this one has a little bit of detail in that. So we would say that he's really moving pretty far away from his typical subject, kind of like Chuck Close did, but someone like him we might think of between abstracted and non-objective. Or we might decide, okay, he's got enough realism in here that you may say, actually on the continuum, he should be somewhere between photoreal and abstracted because he did a photoreal nose, a photoreal ear, all that kind of stuff. So we might put Joseph Lee, say, right here. Okay? Because there's a lot of artwork that's going to be between these modes. Again, we're not stuck with that necessarily. So now we kind of get to good non-objective examples. And so this is a piece by Jackson Pollock. And a lot of people tell me when they see Jackson Pollock's work that they think that, well, their third grade daughter could do it, or their dog could do this, or they could do it in their sleep or whatever, because really it's splashing paint around, right? But it was really avant-garde at the time. Everybody was all about realism when he started doing this kind of stuff, and so it became pretty important. But you can see it doesn't take a lot of skill here. He's literally just throwing paint on the paper, or a canvas in this case. So we really don't need technical skill for this. It's completely unfaithful to reality. He's not trying to represent anything. Now you might look into this and say, oh, I see this or I see that. A lot of times my students will start to see figures or symbols in there. And it takes a lot of imagination to be able to decide what this is and what it means, right? So the painter's giving us a lot less to go on here, so it's definitely not objective. So we're going to put Jackson Pollock way over here. So this painting, it's by Mark Rothko, and he's a color field painter, so he's very similar to Jackson Pollock except without all the energy. So he's more about soft control of the brush strokes. You really don't even see brush strokes in his work. He piles up different colors on top of other colors and creates local suggestions of like how color can infiltrate different areas. This one's called the White Stripe. So even in his title, he doesn't give us very much information as to what he's trying to say with this piece. Most of his work was like this. He really wasn't interested in photorealism. Abstraction, again, there's not much that we can see here, so we would probably put him solidly on non-objective. But we might be able to see a lot of different things happening in here. We really don't see much at all in this, so we might even put this like way over here on the non-objective route. Okay, so last painting, Wassily Kandinsky. And he was kind of one of my favorites, working in Russia in the 50s, 40s. So he has a lot more in terms of line and color and organization, okay? He's not really representing things, but again, a lot of my students see things in here like different symbols. A lot of my students have said this kind of looks like a little landscape or something, or like an abstracted skyscraper. These represent maybe moons, orbs, or something like that. So when we're looking at somebody like this, it's going to take a little more skill to draw this cleanly and to like develop good compositional color, sort of color schemes and things. So we might put him somewhere in between abstract and non-objective because he's starting to have somewhat of a representation happening in here with different symbols and things. So again, Kandinsky over here, right? So within this continuum of abstraction, what I typically have my students do is I have them go out and select different works of art that they feel like have these qualities. So what you want to do is you want to find first something photorealistic, because there's going to be a good example or a good wealth of example online that you can pull. Abstracted work, you're going to find way more of that because most artists honestly work within this realm. It takes a lot of sort of time and energy and attention to detail, and it takes much longer to produce a painting like this. And honestly, this lacks expression in a lot of ways, whereas this is much more expressive. It's more interesting to look at, and it offers the artist a lot more choice in terms of how they want to present their ideas to the viewership and the audience. And then sometimes it's non-objective stuff, and it's highly conceptual. They may have like a really strong idea, but they want to obfuscate that or hide it in some way, shape, or form by just using line, form, texture, shape, color, value, space. They're using the raw materials of art to make this. You're going to find a good number of examples out here like this as well. So what I want you to do is find an example of a photorealistic painting, an abstracted painting, and a non-objective painting. I then want you to find something that you feel like would be in between on this continuum, something that has some photorealistic elements, but it's been abstracted, kind of like Joseph Lee's work. I want you to find something that is approaching abstraction, but it has a lot of non-objective qualities as well, that it would fit in here, too. So when you do this, it would be best to put all of these either in a Word document or perhaps a PowerPoint, and go ahead and develop that, label each one of the images that you find, and you'll want to get the artist's name, right? So like in this case, Kandinsky. Rothko. Van Gogh down here. Pollock up here. Now it's like really hard to see. Getting really disorganized, huh? Chuck Close here and here, so. Joseph Lee. And, Audrey Flack. So identify the artist that you found with their name, and then what I'm really interested in is an explanation as to why you have decided to choose the artist that you did and the painting that you did for the two that are between photorealism and abstracted and not objective. I want you to talk a little bit about why you placed those there. The others I'm not so concerned with, because you'll find good examples of those all over. Just like when I was talking about with Joseph Lee's work, how we can